Welcome to Scary Stories for a Rainy Night. All of the stories you will hear are allegedly true and actually happened. I want to remind you that, as always, there are minimal ads in this video. Only 3 ads after the first 3 stories. And last thing, before we begin, if you enjoy this video and would like to show your support to my channel, please subscribe and like the video for me. It really helps me out a lot. Now, let's begin. The story I'm about to share takes place on 2 different occasions. My grandparents live in rural southern Ohio, near the edge of the Appalachian Trail. It's very vital to describe the layout of my grandparents' property for everyone to understand this story. My grandparents' house sits on 5 acres, surrounded by thick wooded areas. On the property, there are 7 different trails that lead you all around my grandparents' house that we usually use for hunting. One day, my brother and I decided to walk to the trails. We enjoyed riding 4-wheelers and taking in the scenery of my grandparents' secluded property. The trail we were on splits into 2 other trails. The trail to the left loops you back around to the house, and the other trail to the right takes you down to the creek, where you could sit and watch all kinds of wildlife. My brother and I decided we wanted to go down to the creek and watch for animals, while also looking for cool rocks that I loved to collect at the time. At the split, the only way to get down to the creek is to walk, as the 4-wheeler is too big to fit through all of the thick brush and trees on that specific trail. So we ditched the 4-wheeler and took off on foot. The trail down to the creek is about a mile long. The sun was shining through the trees, and it was a crisp fall evening where there was a slight breeze. My brother and I goofed off until we finally made it to the creek. We walked alongside the water for maybe 15 minutes, looking for cool rocks, as I said before. As we are walking, we stumble across a broken down shed that both my brother and I had never seen. It is important to mention that my grandparents' property has markers, letting everyone know where their property begins and ends. Standing on the left side of the creek, the shed was on the opposite side. My brother and I kind of looked at each other with confused looks, but eventually my brother got distracted by something else and continued his walk down the creek. But not me. I felt myself fall into some sort of trance. I felt as if I needed to go inside. I yelled for my brother to come back. I said, "Jay, I think we should check this out some more. Something inside me really wants to go inside." My brother has never been a fan of anything remotely scary. Seeing this rundown shed that looked to be falling apart did not interest him in the slightest. My brother responded, "This is one of those situations in a scary movie where the people should have just minded their business, and you are not going in there." I kind of chuckled because he was right. Something was telling me to go in there, but I also knew it probably wasn't the best idea, as the sun was starting to set. My brother and I collected our rock findings and headed back to the house. This next part happened the following weekend. My boyfriend at the time came out to visit. While he was there, I had mentioned the fact that my brother and I had stumbled across a creepy shed that was on the property that we had never seen before. He became extremely interested as I described the feeling I had of wanting to go inside. I told him how compelled I was to the building. That's all it took before we were out the door and making our way back down to the creek. My brother stayed behind, saying, "If you guys don't come back, I told you so." My ex-boyfriend and I laughed like, "Yeah, right." With us, we had overalls and flashlights as we didn't take the 4-wheeler and decided to just walk the whole way down. We had flashlights due to the fact that when we left, we knew we had only about 2 hours until the sun went down. Eventually, we make it down to the creek. We walk the same way that my brother and I had the week previous. And to my shock and disbelief, the shed was no longer there. I start frantically looking around, saying, "What? How? It was right here." My ex-boyfriend and I decide to walk a little bit further down, venturing further and further away from my grandparents' house. Still no sign of the shed. We hadn't realized how long we were out there. The sun maybe had 15 more minutes of light left for the day. I was so determined to prove myself right that I had seen this shed with my own 2 eyes. We pull out our flashlights and jump across the bank to the other side of the creek and begin walking back the way we came. I was hoping that I had just missed it on the way down, as my ex and I were talking. The sun was completely down at this point. As we are walking and talking, my ex falls silent. We were in mid-conversation, so when I hear him stop dead in his tracks, I do the same. I start asking, "What's wrong?" What he said next sent chills down my spine. "I want you to listen to me very carefully. When I count to 3, we are going to jump to the other side, and we are going to run as fast as we can. Don't say anything. Don't turn around. Don't look back." My heart falls to my stomach, and in that moment, I didn't question him. I just prepared myself to run. 1, 2, 3. We sprinted as fast as we could. I was in front of my ex, and I could hear him wincing in pain. But I heard more than just our running. Something was right behind us. We ditched the whole idea of running a mile all the way back to the trail and decided to make a run for it straight through the woods. When we made it back to the house, we were gasping for air and covered in scratches from running through thick brush. We walked through the front door, and I was in shock to the point of where I could not answer my grandma's questions. My ex-boyfriend was gripping at his back and wincing in pain. My grandma lifted his shirt to look at it. 3 long scratches stemming from his shoulder to his lower back. He had seen something in those woods that night, and whatever it was chased us all the way back to the house, leaving me in a shocked state, and my ex-boyfriend with 3 scratch marks from whatever it was. Don't go looking for something you don't want to find. And if anyone knows what this could have been, please let me know. This occurrence still keeps me up at night. I'm what they call a creature of the night. It's not uncommon for me to stay up till the rising of the sun. In fact, most weekends I do just that. So it wasn't unusual for me to be up at 2:29 a.m. on a Saturday morning. It was unusual to receive a phone call at that time. Still, I didn't think much of it. I have a fairly large family, and my grandma had been in and out of the hospital recently. I picked up the phone, and I said, "Hello?" There were no intelligible words I could make out. It was just rustling and low growling noises coming from the other end of the line. I hung up the phone, figuring it was some kids playing a practical joke. I picked up my controller and resumed playing my game. When the phone rang again, I didn't even bother picking it up. The phone rang a 3rd time, and once again, I ignored it. On the 4th ring, I was fed up with the little brats. I answered, yelling into the receiver, "Stop calling me!" This time I got a response. The person on the other end said, "Terrence, you're going to pay." "Pay for what?" I asked. A click was the only response I received. This had to be a prank from one of my brain-dead friends. I was not a bad guy and couldn't think of anything I had done to anyone. Still, my heart was beating faster, and I could hardly keep myself from looking out the window. I decided to make a preliminary check around my house. I have seen enough horror movies to know the possible ways of entry. I made sure all the doors were locked and the windows were shut. As I rounded back to my gaming chair, I looked out the window to see a lone man standing directly underneath the streetlight across from my house. He was holding a large fire axe and had some sort of mask over his face. To my dismay, he was slowly crossing the street directly over to my house. Officially, I began to freak out. I did my civic duty and promptly let the cops know. At this point, the man had marched directly to my front door and began smashing it with his axe. I was still in college at this time, so the dump of a house I was renting in was not known for having reinforced anything. With a few heavy strikes, the masked stranger had the door sliced into ribbons. I was hiding in my bedroom, in my closet. If I could just remain hidden long enough for the police to arrive, then I would be okay. My bedroom door was kicked in, and I heard the man checking underneath the bed. Next, he moved to the bathroom. My heart began to beat outside of my chest. There was nowhere else to check but the closet. Still, I heard no sirens. It looked as if it was up to me. I closed my eyes in resolve and prepared for the man to open the door. I heard his heavy footsteps making the old floorboards creak with each step. As he neared, my breaths became more rapid. He must have been able to hear them. No point in hiding anymore. He was reaching for the door. I exploded into motion, kicking the heavy wooden door directly into his face with so much force it came off of its hinges. The intruder was slammed across the room. In seconds, I was on top of him, ripping him to shreds with my bare hands. I scooped up handfuls of his still warm flesh into my mouth, savoring every bite. His cries tampered off with a wet squelching sound formed in the back of his throat. And just like that, all was over. His body remained still. I remained there drenched from his lifeblood. After all, I am a creature of the night. I've lived in the beautiful city of Los Angeles for about 8 years now. My family in the Midwest always asks me, "Isn't there so much crime there? I don't know how you deal with it." But other than getting my car battery stolen a few times and the terrifying incident I'm about to share with y'all, I haven't really encountered much. This occurred in an apartment complex in Hollywood I was living in with 3 roommates about a year before the pandemic hit. For those who haven't been to Hollywood, let me set the scene. Most of it is the complete opposite of the glamorous, celebrity-filled mecca that we are shown in the movies and pop culture. Maybe it really was glamorous at one point, and those remnants can be felt in some places. But now, it seems to be a magnet for the sketchiest people you can imagine. It's extremely dirty, and sometimes feels unsafe to walk the streets by yourself during the day, let alone at night. You truly never know who you will run into, and I don't mean that in a good way. Now for the apartment complex itself. As mentioned, this is a sketchy area, but for whatever reason, my complex didn't have any security on site, ever. I've lived in far less sketchy apartments in LA that had security patrolling the buildings at all times, so not having any just seemed a bit insane. To make things worse, the complex would rent out certain apartment units to Airbnb guests, meaning that randos were entering and leaving the building 24/7. Both of these elements contributed to what happened on the night in question, which also happened to be the day I moved in. So on this day, I was almost done moving all of my stuff in. It was around 9 p.m. that night, and all that was left to carry inside from my car was a suitcase full of clothes and a stack of records. I walked into the lobby of the complex carrying this stuff and waited for one of the 2 elevators to come. As I was waiting, a group of 3 or 4 people entered the lobby who were clearly here for an Airbnb, judging by their luggage and wide-eyed sense of wonderment. As this group came into the lobby doors, which were entirely made of see-through glass, I noticed a man lingering directly behind them. My first glance at this man filled me with a feeling of dread. You could just tell that this was someone off the street who did not need to be entering this building. He was tall, with wild hair, wearing a filthy wife-beater that I'm assuming was white at one point. He had a dangerous, dead-eyed quality that communicated to me that he was out of it, on something, drunk, or something else. Not sure, but I knew that I did not want this man in my building. The group of tourists continued chatting to each other, completely oblivious to this man, trailing them. To my dismay, they allowed him to stagger into the lobby, right behind them. Now, myself, the tourists, and the man are all standing at the front of the elevators. The tourists still seemingly oblivious to how unhinged and potentially dangerous this man seemed. As both of the elevator doors opened at the same time, I scurried into one, and the tourist shuffled into the other. To my absolute horror, the man jumped into my elevator at the last second, as the doors closed. I realized I was in there trapped, alone with him. Now, I am already a paranoid person who is way too addicted to horror and true crime, so I was freaking out at this point. I was standing as close to the front of the elevator as possible, while the man stayed toward the back. It became more and more apparent that this was a man who was on something and incoherent as he began muttering things I couldn't understand behind me. I had no idea if it was directed toward me, himself, or an unknown entity that only he could see, but I didn't turn around or look his way, out of fear of encouraging it. His mutterings grew louder as I continued standing toward the front of the elevator, praying that he wouldn't try anything. The man then gruffly snarled, "Hey!" I shot him a look out of pure reflex to see him with an undone zipper, touching himself, and staring at me with those dazed, unwell eyes. This entire sequence felt like an eternity, but was probably only about 1 minute or so. As we finally reached my floor and the doors opened, I walked out of the elevator as quickly but as calmly as possible, not wanting to provoke him further. I lived at the end of the hallway, a straight shot from the elevator. I was about halfway down the hallway thinking that I was possibly in the clear, as he didn't seem to be following me, but I could still hear the man making incoherent noises from the elevator. I glanced behind me to see the man exit the elevator. "Roar!" he yelled down at me. And that was it. I was not about to make it this far to get attacked now. I started running, still dragging my suitcase and holding my records. And to my panic, he started running after me. My stuff crashed to the ground as I dropped it and ran as fast as I could to my door, which was unlocked, thank God, due to my other roommates being home. As I slammed the door shut and locked it, the man reached our door, muttering and growling. I honestly don't even think he knew where he was or what he was doing. He seriously seemed that messed up. Maybe he only started running because I started running? Who knows? But thankfully I had made it to my door before him, thanks to his pause before coming after me. After I had gotten inside my apartment, I was shaking and crying from the shock of it all, and sitting with my back against the door. My roommates had heard me scream as I was running down the hallway, which I wasn't even aware of doing, and came to ask me what had happened. I explained the story to them, but was too scared to look outside of the people at that point. My roommates did for me, and said that the man was just wandering around our hallway, looking lost for a few minutes before going back down the elevator. Surprisingly, that was the only crazy thing that really happened in that apartment. There was one time that the glass doors in the lobby got completely shattered by someone, and we were literally without doors for a while, leaving us exposed to anyone who wanted to wander in and do whatever they wanted. Oh well, I'm glad I made it out of that place, alive. Two years ago, I took a part-time job that still haunts me to this day. I decided to finally write about my experience, hoping it might help process everything. I was a college student, and like a lot of you, I needed a part-time job to help cover tuition and other expenses. After a long search, I found what seemed like the perfect job. It was a caregiver position, working from 5 p.m. to 9 p.m., taking care of elderly people. The job was pretty straightforward. Make sure they took their meds, had their meals, and just hang out with them for a few hours. I got assigned to take care of this 85-year-old lady. Let's call her Mrs. Eleanor to keep things anonymous. She lived alone in this quaint little house on the edge of town. The place was old but well kept, with a charming, slightly overgrown garden that probably hadn't seen a gardener in a few years. She had a small poodle named Max, who was always by her side, following her around everywhere she went. From the start, the house felt off. There were no family pictures anywhere. I mean, you would think at her age, she would have photos of kids, grandkids, maybe an old lover or something. But no, nothing. It was weird. The walls were bare except for a few generic paintings. I asked her about it once, just casually during a conversation, but she brushed it off and changed the subject real fast. She had this look in her eyes, a mix of sadness and something I couldn't quite place. I didn't push it because I didn't want to lose the job, but it definitely made me curious. My daily routine was simple enough. I would get there around 5 p.m., cook dinner, make sure she took her meds, and just keep her company for a few hours. Max, the poodle, was a friendly little guy, always happy to see me, wagging his tail and jumping around despite his age. Mrs. Eleanor, though, was polite but pretty reserved. She didn't talk much about her past or family, which just added to the mystery. Our conversations were always pretty basic, like talking about the weather or what was on the news. Every evening as I cleaned up after dinner, I would hear Mrs. Eleanor singing a lullaby. It was the same soft melodic tune every night, echoing through the quiet house. While the song was gentle, it really creeped me out. It felt so out of place in the otherwise silent house. She sang it every night, like clockwork, and it always made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Sometimes I would find myself pausing my cleaning just to listen. The whole situation was unsettling. The house, the lack of family photos, the nightly lullaby. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was a deeper, darker story behind those melodies. It was like the house held secrets that it wasn't ready to share, and I was just an outsider, peeking in. As the weeks went by, my curiosity grew stronger. Why was she singing this lullaby every night? Who was it for? The routine stayed the same, but the sense of unease kept building. I had been given strict instructions by my employer to not go into Mrs. Eleanor's room. It was one of the non-negotiable rules of the job, probably to respect her privacy and maintain professional boundaries. One evening, while I was cleaning the dishes, I noticed that the door to Mrs. Eleanor's small office was slightly open. She had always kept it closed, and had told me it was just a mess she didn't want me to fuss around with. But that evening, the door was invitingly open. Hearing her close the bathroom door upstairs, I decided to take the chance and peek inside the office. The room looked straight out of the 1960s. Blue walls, a small single bed, a wooden desk cluttered with old papers. There was a small closet to the left that caught my eye. The whole setup struck me as odd. This room, which looked like it belonged to a young boy, was in the home of an elderly woman living alone. There were no pictures, no personal belongings, nothing to explain why this room was here. I couldn't explore more because I heard footsteps right above me, making my heart race. Panicking, I quickly closed the door and hurried back to the kitchen. The rest of the evening went by uneventfully. I gave her the necessary pills, made sure she was comfortable, and left for the night. But I couldn't stop thinking about that room. Why would she have a boy's room in her house if she had no children? The thought gnawed at me, creating a whirlwind of questions. The next day, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to do some research on Mrs. Eleanor. I spent hours online searching for any information about her, but nothing came up. No social media profiles, no news articles, nothing. Not a single piece of information about her life. It was baffling and left me with more questions than answers. I returned to work after the weekend, determined to find out more. That evening, as usual, I prepared dinner and ensured Mrs. Eleanor took her medication. Then I waited for her to go to the bathroom. The moment I heard the bathroom door close, I quickly made my way to the office. The room was just as I had left it, with that same lingering, musty smell hanging in the air. This time I opened the closet. Inside I found small boxes, stacked neatly, but covered in a thin layer of dust. My heart pounded as I opened one to find baby clothes, tiny socks, pants, and sweaters, all meant for a baby boy. They were neatly folded and seemed well preserved, despite their apparent age. But why would Mrs. Eleanor have these? The discovery left me with more questions than answers. I went back to making dinner, trying to process what I had found. My mind was racing with possibilities, but none of them made any sense. Was it possible she had a child once? If so, where was he now? That night, as usual, Mrs. Eleanor began singing her lullaby. Normally, this song would send shivers down my spine, creeping me out every time. But this night was different. Instead of fear, I felt a surge of curiosity that I could not ignore. I went upstairs quietly, and with each step up, the lullaby grew louder. The door to her bedroom was almost closed, but had a small gap, just enough for me to peek through. She always left a gap, saying it was to let Max come and go as he pleased. I peered through the gap and was shocked by what I saw. There, Mrs. Eleanor was sitting in a rocking chair, gently swaying back and forth. She was holding Max in her arms, cradling him like a baby, and singing softly to him. Next to her was a small wooden cradle, old and worn, as if it hadn't been used in years. She continued her lullaby, her voice soft and melodic, but now it felt more sad than creepy. Her gentle rocking, the way she cradled Max, and the soft melody of the lullaby created an image that was hard to shake. I slowly backed away from the door, not wanting to intrude any further. I went back downstairs, my mind spinning from what I had just seen. This made me think and start connecting all the dots. Was she pretending her dog was a baby? A baby she never had? I could be wrong, but that would make sense, right? The boys' room, the baby clothes, no pictures, no husband, no children, just her and her dog, whom she pretended was her own son. There are many possibilities. Maybe she lost her child during a miscarriage, or the son died somehow. It's heartbreaking to think about, but I had no way of knowing for sure since there was nothing about her online. I even asked my boss about Mrs. Eleanor, trying to get some information about her past. My boss didn't know much either, just that Mrs. Eleanor had always been a bit reserved and private. She mentioned that Mrs. Eleanor had experienced some tragic losses and that she was now quite lonely with some health issues typical for her age, but nothing specific. I worked out the rest of the week, but everything felt so creepy and intense. The quiet dinners together, the silence in the house, the haunting lullaby. It all felt like I was living in some kind of ghost story. Each night as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what I had seen. The pieces seemed to fit together, but they painted a picture that was too tragic and eerie for me to handle. Even during the day, I found myself distracted, replaying conversations with Mrs. Eleanor in my mind, looking for clues I might have missed. I thought about asking her directly, but quickly dismissed the idea. It felt too intrusive, and honestly, I was scared of what I might uncover. There was a part of me that didn't want to know the full story, because the fragments I had were already too much. I noticed more details that added to the unsettling atmosphere. The way Mrs. Eleanor would sometimes pause mid-sentence, as if lost in a distant memory, or how she would stroke Max's fur with a faraway look in her eyes. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. I made my decision. I sent a text message to my boss saying that I couldn't continue with the job, and that I was quitting immediately. I didn't even say goodbye to Mrs. Eleanor. It felt wrong, and I know it was rude, but I just couldn't bring myself to face her again. I thought of another day in that house, surrounded by haunting memories and unanswered questions, was too much for me to handle. I felt a mix of guilt and relief. Guilt for leaving without a proper goodbye, for abandoning Mrs. Eleanor when she clearly needed someone, but also relief, knowing that I wouldn't have to endure another evening of lullabies and unsettling silences. I knew I was being cowardly, but I just couldn't do it. The experience had taken a toll on me, and I needed to get out. The whole experience was something I couldn't shake off easily. It made me think a lot about the hidden struggles people face and the ways they cope with their pain. Mrs. Eleanor's story, whatever the full truth was, taught me that sometimes the past can cast a long shadow over the present. So that's my story. It was a job that I thought would be simple, but it ended up being one of the most emotionally intense experiences of my life. So this happened around 7 to 8 years ago, when I was around 14 or 15 years old. I recently started hanging out with a newly made friend who is 1 year older than me, and for anonymity's sake, I'm only going to call him C, since we aren't in contact anymore. We didn't have any sort of falling out because of the story you are about to hear. We just grew apart over the years. It just happens in life. I just started smoking, which had become a problem in my life later on, but that's not what this is about. I know, very dumb teenage habit, but I quit years ago. But during my teenage years, it was, although bad, a way for me to take my mind off of dumb little problems. So we smoked in the park. We had great laughs and were just messing around. As the evening slowly faded into darkness, the people around us started heading home, but not us. This park is fairly large, and we were surrounded by bushes, trees, empty becoming benches, and now unused bike trails. Right next to us sat this giant tower, in German called the Flak Tower, which simply explained means Air Bombs Defender Tower. It was used during the Second World War, too, so as you can guess, defend Nazi Germany, Austria from the bombs of the Allies. This already sat quite an eerie atmosphere, as we sat right next to this historical landmark, which now, while I'm writing this, I am ashamed to have consumed drugs right next to this death-causing tower. Well, I was young. Don't judge me. As time went by, it had become completely dark out, and by this point, we had gotten relatively high. The moon shone a dim light on the grass around us, making it impossible to see or recognize anything or anyone further than a few meters in eyesight. You might ask yourself now why there were no streetlights in such a huge park after the sun went down, in a 2 million inhabitants capital city. And honestly, I felt the same way back then. So I asked C, "Dude, where are the lights? I can't see anything." To which he replied, "The park is closed after 10 p.m., so they shut everything down and locked the park down." I felt kind of annoyed that he hadn't told me earlier that we would have to climb up the gates to get out. But quickly my annoyance turned into high-ridden laughter as we joked about smoking the whole night through or spray painting inside the park. Just very, very dumb 14-year-old teenage humor. Our stoned giggling would very soon come to an unnerving end. I lit up a cigarette and blew the smoke in the warm summer night breeze, still sitting on the only used bench of the whole park, while C sat before me, jamming to music and contemplating on whether smoking another joint or resting his eyes shortly. He chose doing the first. The next part will sound extremely ridiculous, but I swear this is how it happened, word for word. So as he rolled up the joint, we started to hear rustling in the bushes nearby. At first, we didn't really take up on it, but as the sound continuously had gotten louder, our eyes were locked onto said bush. We didn't move an inch. We just sat there, quietly, curiously awaiting to see if there were any foxes or any other animal messing around. But what came next shook us to the bones. As the rustling started up again, a gigantic man crawled forward out of the bush, wearing only what looked like hospital patient's clothing. He didn't speak as he came into our eyesight under the very dim moonlight. He slowly got up from the ground, and as he fully emerged, we first were really able to recognize his height. This man was for sure above 2 meters tall, standing barefoot on the grass, and he looked like he had been clean shaven on every single inch of his body, except for his bushy eyebrows. He stared down my friend, expressionless, showing no emotion behind his pale, wide eyes, just simply locking his eyes on C, whose face had turned ghostly white by this point. He looked like he had forgotten everything around him, except for this man in front of us. The paper and filter still in his hand, C was shaking so hard, the tobacco fell onto his trembling legs. We were frozen by the sight of the deranged-looking man, resting his widespread legs like rocks on the ground. Shivers went down my spine as he creepily greeted us with a "hello" that sounded like he had tried to imitate your friendly next-door neighbor. We didn't reply back, both feeling glued to our seats, filled with fear on what to do next. But what really happened next, I could have never imagined. I hope I looked up the correct translation for this word. This man, wearing only hospital patient's clothing, clean-shaven, more than 2 meters tall, did a roly-poly, like a forward roll that young kids do. Yes, This insane man did a roly-poly to move forward to us. He now stood directly in front of us, and as I said before, I had been scared. I for sure was now 1,000,000 times more. The adrenaline levels in my body spiked to a high that I've never felt before. He grimly stared down at us again, greeting us with this creepy, "Hello." We didn't know what to do. For sure, we could have tried to run away as fast as our bodies would have allowed us to. But this massive man-baby, who clearly suffered from some kind of mental disorder, would have outrun us in a few seconds with his giant legs. So, we just kept on sitting, scared to the core, not saying a word, not knowing what would happen next, and frozen in fear. Only knowing we would have to get through this together. I was around 14 years old when it happened. For context, I was quite introverted and selective about who I get close to me as a teen. I'm still that way, even as an adult. I had made a small number of friends, despite my reserved stance, 2 of whom are my dearest friends to this day. I did my best in school and participated in a couple after-school clubs, which allowed me to delve further into my interests and hobbies, though I also spent a decent amount of time on social media. I was well behaved and made a lot of smart choices during my teen years, thankfully, due to being raised right by my mother, who did her best to steer me in the right direction. However, here is where I stood out. I was alternative, goth, punk rock, whatever you want to call it, and I've always had an affinity for the morbid, paranormal, and darker subjects, which reflected in the way I dressed, the music I would listen to, the books I would read, TV shows and YouTube videos that I would watch. Some people found me and my interests to be weird, or quote-unquote, of the devil. One of these main people who would insist on such things was my grandmother, whom we'll call Gail for privacy's sake. She would take every opportunity to criticize the music I listened to, my clothes, and me in general. You would think that she was some sort of religious fanatic, doing her due diligence to help bring a heathen grandchild closer to God. But no, Grandma Gail isn't religious by any means. You would barely hear her speak of God or religion, and she has never stepped foot inside of a church for Sunday service. Whereas I believed in God and had a personal relationship with him, despite not being religious or attending church myself. Grandma Gail dabbles in witchcraft, a person who engaged in occult practices, something I never wanted to get into, judging a teen goth for her style interests. Talk about hypocrisy. Anyway, there was always something unsettling about Gail, something that teetered on the edge of downright sinister. On top of being severely judgmental and self-righteous, she isn't the easiest of people to get along with. She has a knack of taunting people with her words, using things people have told her against them, and just being downright rude and unprovoked. But I and a few others have grown accustomed to it, and have learned to work around her mood changes. I can recall a time when I was only 4, playing with a couple of Barbie dolls in the kitchen. Mind you, I wasn't making a ton of noise, at least that I can remember, but at one point I must have gotten a little loud unintentionally, because she rushed into the kitchen with this stern, yet calm look on her face, which made me feel uneasy as I looked up at her from the floor, still holding my dolls. In this eerily relaxed tone of voice, she said to me, "Darla," not my actual name, "if you don't stop making noise, I'm going to send something your way tonight. Your mama won't be able to hear your screams. She won't even be able to save you. It'll fly away with you and take you for punishment." Where? I wanted to ask, but I was too nonplussed to speak. Fear didn't hit me, surprisingly. I was more nonplussed than anything, because nothing along those lines had been said to me before. I stared back, my mouth probably nearly hitting the floor as my 4-year-old brain tried to process what she had just said to me. I didn't tell my mom when she came to pick me up, as it must have slipped my mind, and I chalked it up to her wanting to scare me into being quiet. In my late teen years and early 20s, I noticed pentagrams on various reading materials she had. I've witnessed her practicing what I now know to be spells or rituals against those she felt had wronged her, or those she cared deeply about. She would make a list of said people, or have a picture of them and spit on it, only to bury it underground or light it on fire. She is also known to collect people's hair and do God only knows what with it. I'm pretty sure my name has been on some of those lists a handful of times, but nothing ever came of it. Of course, I know God looked out for me each time. Now, on to the sleep paralysis experience. During summer vacation, I would always be dropped off at my grandparents' home, as most kids in my community were, while our parents went to work. As per the usual routine, I would get up early with my mom and get ready to be dropped off to either get some extra sleep in or watch YouTube on my iPad in the morning, while Grandma Gail watched her shows. It was during the first or second week of summer break. On this particular morning, I was extremely tired, mainly due to it being that time of the month for me. It was extremely sunny out, but not too hot. Once I arrived, I shut the door behind me, laid my iPad and overnight bag on top of the dresser, and got into bed. The layout of the guest room was a standard 4-walled room. It was small, about 8 by 10 feet, with a bed next to the window, a small closet in front of it, and a small dresser to the right of it. The curtains were drawn back, allowing sunlight to spill into the room. As soon as my head hit the pillow, I curled up with my hoodie and fell asleep. I'm not sure how long I slept. All I can remember is that I dreamed that a man was chasing me through the woods. He dressed in a raggedy white t-shirt full of holes and tattered jeans. As I was trying to hide behind a tree, he found me and grabbed my wrist, trying to pull me toward him. I must have been tossing and turning in my sleep, because once my eyes shot open, I was staring straight up at the ceiling. I tried turning over, but my body wouldn't, rather couldn't, move. I tried to open my mouth and say something, but no words formed. Not even a sound came from my throat. I felt this sudden heaviness in my chest. It was a feeling I had never felt before. It felt as if a thick, dark fog was engulfing me, making it difficult to take one slow breath at a time. All I could do was lie still, despite trying to move my legs, arms, and head. I felt pressure applied to my wrists and ankles as if I were being restrained. And then came the blood-curdling scream of a woman. It sounded as if the scream went directly into my ear. Then all I heard next was nothing. Just complete still silence. I spotted a dark, shadowy figure hovering over me. It was faceless, abnormally tall, smoky with human-proportioned limbs. It lowered its hands to my face, causing me to panic. I began to cry. At least I felt like I wanted to, but no tears fell from my eyes. Just muffled cries. The foreboding figure then placed its hands on my mouth and pulled it open. One hand pulling at my jaw, the other pulling at my upper lip. The pain I felt as those cold, heavy hands forced my mouth open was immense. The terror I felt now stunted my thoughts as I lie there, unable to stop whatever was happening next. That's when I began to pray in my mind. No prayer in particular. It was just me mentally repeating the words, "Please, God, help me," over and over again. Just as it pressed its hand over my nose, the figure disappeared. The heaviness was no longer in the room, and I shot straight up as I gasped for breath. The sounds of the TV blaring from my grandparents' room drowned out my sobs and gasps as I cradled my knees to my chest, trying to catch my breath and gather my thoughts. I could not comprehend what had just happened, but I knew it was very much so real. I understood why it was called sleep paralysis, due to your ability to speak or move being taken away. But there was also a paralyzing fear I felt during the episode. Amplify that fear 10 times. I'd experienced episodes where I would be unable to move or speak, but there was never a presence that I could see in the room. Only a feeling of intense dread and terror. Something told me to roll up my shirt sleeve and look at my arm that had been grabbed in my dream. Once I pulled back the right sleeve of my shirt, my heart nearly stopped beating in my chest. There was a faint dirt handprint where the man in my dream had grabbed me. At this point, I began to hyperventilate. I called my mom to tell her what happened. She said she would call me back when she went somewhere private. I assumed the panic and terror in my shaky voice was unmistakable. Once she called me back, she listened to me without saying anything until I was finished. I tried my best to articulate what had just happened through sobs and a hushed voice, because I didn't want Grandma Gail to hear me. My mom reassured me that she believed everything I had just told her. She promised to take me to get ice cream after her shift. Then she said, "Do you remember the things you told me you saw take place there?" "Yes," I answered, recalling the lists and burning of the names. Once a door has been opened for such things to occur, all kinds of things can happen. There's definitely an evil presence there. I'm just so sorry this happened to you. She offered to stay on the phone with me as long as I needed, but I knew she had work to do and promised to call her again if I felt the need to. Needless to say, I didn't go back to sleep. I'm not even sure if I was able to fall asleep that night in my own home. To this day, I haven't had a sleep paralysis episode as intense as that one, and I've had a few happen between then and now. The strange part is that 99% of the time, they happened in that room at my grandparents' home. The less intense 1% happened in the comfort of my own home. I believe ghosts, demons, and malevolent spirits exist. There is no other possible logical explanation for how the handprint got on my wrist, but I'm certain a demon was in the room with me that morning, trying to prey on an innocent teen, and God protected me amidst it all. That was 14 years ago, and I'm still a goth, still rock out to my favorite bands. I'm even more fascinated with things people consider morbid, and still enjoy a good horror film and mystery novel. I'm completing my mortuary license. I get to drive a hearse and dye my hair cool colors. And yes, my mom and I are still very close, and she's very proud of the woman I have become. One thing is for certain, though. There is true evil out there, seen and unseen. Entities that masquerade as humans or spirits that linger, waiting for a perfect opportunity to attack or latch onto an unsuspecting host. Something comforting to remember is, as sure as evil exists, so does good. Stay safe and vigilant, everyone, and be careful what you get into. Some curiosities are better off unexplored. While this story may not be one that makes you stay up all night, it is one I tend to think about every fall season. Last year, my boyfriend and I had been so excited for it to be Halloween. We live in an area pretty central to several big Halloween attractions, so we had planned to go to at least one. We finally decided on a haunted attraction about 2 hours from where we live, and when it hit October 1st, we had made plans to take the trip. I drove while my boyfriend, his little brother, and his little cousin rode along. You might think that this is going to be a scary story about the attraction itself, but you would be wrong. The attraction was actually very enjoyable, with about 4 or 5 different haunted areas to go through. We left around midnight after filling up on cider and hot chocolate and started making our way back home. Because this was a completely new area for me, I had been using GPS on my phone to take us there and back. While we were talking about how much we loved the attraction and who all we would like to bring along next time, I got distracted and missed a turn that would have taken us off the back road and onto the major highway. The road, aptly named Spooky Nook Lane, was extremely dark, as there were no street lamps or homes nearby, and there were no other cars out at that time of night. I slowed enough to allow my phone to reroute us, and saw that the new route would keep us on Spooky Nook Lane until we hit a stop sign. I figured that was easy enough, so I returned my focus to the road and the conversation. As I approached the stop sign, however, we all noticed a large silhouette in the middle of the road. At first, we thought it was a deer or even a bear that had been hit by a car. I slowed to a crawl to find a way to get around it, but gasped in surprise as it started to move. It was then that we realized that this was not an animal, but a human man. A human man who had definitely been hit by a car. I shouted at my boyfriend to dial 911 as I pulled over and put my hazard lights on. I rolled down the window and shouted to the man, asking if he was okay. As my boyfriend explained the situation to the 911 dispatcher, my boyfriend's younger cousin pointed out that there was a beat-up van parked on the other side of the road, shortly past the stop sign. I then saw that not only was the van on and running, but there appeared to be another man jumping in the back seat. He then slammed the door shut and the van sped off. I returned my focus to the man in the road, who was now hobbling his way to my car. We repeatedly asked him what happened, but he was severely disoriented and spoke very little English, it seemed. I pointed in the direction the van had gone and asked if they had hit him, to which he replied in the affirmative. My boyfriend pointed to the phone, still active with the 911 dispatcher, and assured him that help was on its way. At this point, the man became more verbal, repeatedly saying, "No police. No police." We explained that we weren't getting him in trouble, that we were trying to get him medical assistance. He continued to say, "No," and eventually started hobbling away while mumbling something about living nearby. The dispatcher heard this conversation, and while she agreed that he sounded like he needed help, there was very little she could do if he was not willing to stay put until the ambulance arrived. She canceled the call-out, and we thanked her for her help anyway. We all sat there stunned at first, wondering what in the world had just happened. The man definitely did not live nearby, and had to have suffered a concussion at the very least. As I started driving away, we started talking about what could it have been. After some pretty wild theories, we settled on the most likely explanation. The man had had some sort of falling out with the people in the van, who purposefully attempted to run him over. When they saw us approach, they probably realized that we would be calling 911 and decided to bolt. As for why the man refused emergency services, we have two possible theories. Either the man was an undocumented citizen, or he and his van buddies had been up to something less than legal. If anyone has any other theories, I'm all ears. To this day, I wonder about the real story behind that night, and what would have happened to that man if I had made the right turn instead. I have a fear. We all do, and I'm sure this fear is common with many others. I fear aliens. I believe in aliens. I'm sure many people around the world agree with both statements. But can you say that you have been visited by aliens? I have never put this story on any form of hard copy, and very few people I associate with even know the story. But the few people who do know it suggested that I share it with all of you, because they think this is the type of story that will pique your interest. I'm 31 now, and this happened when I was 17. But I remember this event with so much vivid detail, it's almost as if it happened just a few minutes ago. At this time in my life, my 7-person family lived in a single wide trailer on a big plot of land owned by my stepmom's parents. To better picture the event, I'm about to share with you the layout of the land. When you first turn into the driveway on the left-hand side at the top of the land sits a double-wide trailer, which was inhabited by my stepmom's parents. The driveway turns to head to their place, but then loops around, taking you back to the main driveway and down to the second trailer, which was our very crowded home. Right next to our trailer was the corn crop field. It wasn't one of those huge fields that you see in the movies or on the sides of rural roads, just a simple, decent-sized field, which we harvested and tended to during the summer vacations. When you enter our trailer, you walk right into the living area, and immediately to your right is my parents' room. The living room opens into the kitchen, and down the hallway, the first room on the left was the boys' room. There were 3 boys. The second door on the left is the bathroom, and at the very end of the trailer is mine and my sister's room. In our room, we shared a trundle bed, and there was a window right next to our dresser, which in those times sat an old box-shaped television and a VCR. When the trundle bed was pulled out fully, it would touch the dresser, and if you laid at the foot of it, you could see directly out the window. And since it was a single-wide trailer, the window practically sat on the ground. But the view from the window was one of the eerie proportions. The wonderful view from my bedroom window was the cornfield. As you can imagine, we rarely laid at the foot of the bed and looked out the window. We were young, so the thought of that was just plain scary. One summer night in July, we were all in bed. My sister, being younger than me, always fell asleep before I did. She would grind her teeth in her sleep, and it would be annoying enough for me to move my pillows down to the foot of the bed and just turn my back to the window, even though there were curtains on the window, of course. It was still creepy. I had fallen asleep and was sleeping quite well, when out of nowhere, I woke up. Nothing woke me, it seemed. No noise, no feeling. I just woke up. Sitting up in the bed, I could see a light glaring through the window and sitting on the wall across from me. The light was red in color and would deepen and then brighten. Still half asleep, not understanding and possessing a curious mind, I pulled back the curtain. Hovering over the field was a craft, the shape of an oval. It was huge, and the lights were coming from it. I shook my head as if I was going to shake myself from a dream, but nothing happened. The craft still hovered, and the terror I felt was very real. I stared out the window for quite some time when I noticed movement in the cornfield. I didn't even realize I was holding my breath until the lightheadedness hit me. I watched the movement in the field, anticipating what may come out. When she exited. I say she because this very tall, thin, gray figure had extremely prominent female-like features. I gasped, and when I did, it was almost as if she heard it, and her head whipped around and she made immediate eye contact with me. I slipped out of the bed and hid under the windowsill, as if that was going to hide me. I waited there and watched the red light dance and fade on the wall across from me, when the thought occurred to me. Why am I the only one awake and experiencing this? My sister, she honestly could sleep through a tornado, so it wasn't really her I was thinking about. But had no one else in the trailer noticed or was aware? Feeling a sense of bravery, and honestly that curious mind of mine taking over, I wanted to look out the window again. Slowly I began to rise, letting only my eyes peer out, and when I did, there she was, standing there, as if she were waiting for me to look. I made eye contact with an alien. You don't have to believe me. You can call me crazy. Say I was dreaming, but I know what I saw. The eyes I contacted were big and black. They blinked in a sideways fashion, and her face had two tiny slits where a nose would be, and very thin like lips. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears, holding my breath. There, in front of me, stood an alien. She placed her hand, which only had 4 finger-like parts, and slid the window open. I was bewitched, stuck, unable to move, speak, scream, and apparently even breathe. We maintained eye contact as she reached through the window with very little effort, lifted me and gracefully pulled me through my window. I was still unable to do anything at all. It was almost like she had some type of trance on me. My mind was screaming. My heart was pounding. And if I were able to, I would have been shaking. She placed me on my feet and took my hand. Her hand felt warm. Warmer than mine. Almost feverish. She led me to the craft. In my mind, I was resisting, but my body followed behind her, like a lost puppy. Then all went dark. My eyes flew open as a searing pain ran through my uterus and ovaries. Looking around, I was unable to move still, but that was to my sudden realization, because I was strapped to a table. Surrounding me were similar-looking aliens. They were looking at me as if they were the ones seeing something unfamiliar and new, which upon further thought, to them, I was the alien. It took me a few moments to realize that I was unclothed and very uncomfortably exposed. I started crying and begging them to take me home, to please not hurt me. They just kept looking and moving around me, completing tasks I was unaware of, when again a sharp pain radiated through my reproductive area. I yelled out in pain, pleading that they stop. Then all was dark again. Stirring, I cuddled into my blanket and shot straight up in my bed. I looked around my room and began crying. I was so relieved to be home. I was terrified that they wouldn't bring me back, and convincing myself what I had experienced had to be a very bad dream. The urge to use the restroom hit, and I pushed the blanket off me and discovered a small pool of blood on my bed. I had begun my monthly cycle, way before I was due. I slid to the side of the bed to get up and go to the bathroom. I planted my feet on the floor and stood. When I did this, a pain so intense radiated through my ovaries, my uterus, around to my lower back, and down my legs all the way to my feet. I immediately sat down and huddled over. I was shocked. I remembered everything that happened when I woke. I had decided it was a very vivid dream, but all this pain felt like the pain I was experiencing in the dream. Finally deciding I had to woman through the pain, I stood up and slowly made my way to the bathroom, that thank goodness was not far from my room. Once I got into the bathroom, I turned on the shower and began preparing it. I realized that blood was running down my leg, and I had never had such an issue before. Over the passing months, I continued to experience intense pain in the same area, so bad that I couldn't even go to school for a few days. I was the type of student that enjoyed school and took pride in receiving the perfect attendance certificate at the end of the year. so missing school was a big deal and highly unusual. Seeing that there was obviously something wrong, my dad asked my stepmom to schedule me an appointment at the lady doctor, as he called it. She did so, and only a few days later, I found myself participating in my very first gynecologist appointment. I need not give details. My doctor asked some questions, ran some tests, told me to come back in 2 weeks. We did so, and at the following appointment, the doctor informed me and my stepmom that I had developed endometriosis, and that based on the scarring that was already apparent and the scarring that would continue to develop throughout the years, I would most likely experience issues reproducing. From then on, I have had awful monthly experiences and did have terrible issues conceiving. I did, though, get my miracle baby. She's 5 now, but when in labor with her, 57 hours of it, I ended up having to have an emergency C-section. My heart stopped beating afterward for 3 minutes and 27 seconds. Following my daughter, I became pregnant again. Not purposefully, and certainly against the advice of my doctors. He was a little boy, and I made it to 25 weeks with him before miscarrying and almost hemorrhaging afterwards. I almost lost my life. The issues that I have had and continue to have led me to the point I'm at today. I have a decision to make, and that is to have a full hysterectomy. I haven't built up the courage, honestly, because I'm 31, and my doctor has already told me the biggest downfall to this procedure would be early onset menopause. I feel too young for that. I know that I've shared some personal information here, but I firmly believe that I was taken by aliens, and whatever experiments they had performed caused the issues I dealt and still deal with 14 years later. I don't expect anyone to believe this. I'm not asking anyone to, but I felt maybe it was the time to share it.